bowling ball going back and forth in a line from you to me.
Ladies and gentlemen, we're back again with Marcus Allen, who needs no introduction and is also, as well as the UK distributor for Nexus Magazine, a book. Marcus Allen's book. Marcus Allen's book, The Apollo Moon Hoax, The Real Evidence, by Marcus Allen and Trevor Weaver.
That's right.
So yeah, it's a good read. I'm just started reading it. I haven't finished it yet, but started reading it. I'm going to be talking about this book in my book I'm writing now. We'll get to that a little bit later. But so for those of you out there, it's a very good read. So it's on Amazon.com. It's on Amazon. So just go on there and order it. And I guarantee it's a good read. So everybody.
Basically, for anybody who is confused about Apollo, and who hears both sides of the argument, they say, oh, they landed, 12 astronauts landed, and back in the 60s and 70s, early 70s. And there are some people who say, no, it never happened, like us. We say, no, it never happened. And that book provides the information or the evidence for anybody who is confused about what actually happened. You know, how do you keep 400,000 people quiet if they all knew what was happening? Well, they didn't know what was happening. They thought it was for real. They had no reason to doubt it. It was more than 400,000 people, by the way. It was probably close to 1 million, you know, if you include their families and close friends.
Exactly.
Because people do talk, you know, they discuss things amongst themselves.
Yeah.
That's what they do. And that's where this whole situation has come out, because we talk amongst ourselves, not just you and me, but there are many other people in the, shall we say, the moon hoax community, because it's growing all the time. There's a Facebook page now as well about it.
Yeah.
And all sorts of YouTube films, you know, the Apollo detectives, not just the ones that Robert does, which are brilliant on his YouTube channel, but the ones that Neil Peel and Ben Emlyn Jones put together.
Yes, and they have done some really good work. In fact, it's interesting you brought them up. Neil Peel. I just got an email from Neil, actually, and you remember a year ago, Simon Dan did a hit piece on me.
Yes,
right. It was really funny. I hope he gets this. I hope he sees this video, because I'm laughing, because he just did a hit piece on Robert's channel, and specifically the videos with Scott Henderson. And it was really interesting, Marcus, listening to Skyman Dam. For those of you out there, Skyman Dam, I'll post a link on the video here, part 1, when I post it. But he did a hit piece on me a year ago, and then he's now done a hit piece on Robert Williams' channel, Apollo Detectives, and Scott Henderson. I encourage everybody to watch his video. Not that he needs he gets a lot of views, but I do encourage everybody to watch the video specifically as to how he handles what Scott Henderson is saying. It's absolutely laughable. He has no evidence or no counter evidence, if I can put it that way, or no counter argument to what Scott is saying. All he says in the video is, no, it's not wet. The flag is not wet. Of course it's not wet. Why would they make it wet when they were doing this? If they were going to fake the Apollo moon missions, they would have done a better job. It's not wet. It's all emotional responses. And it was actually quite funny. I actually enjoyed it. I actually enjoyed Skyman Dam. And yes, Skyman Dam, if you see this video, I'm calling you out. Read up, because you obviously have really no idea what you're talking about. So I'm calling you out on this. And, you know, you keep saying you don't want to read my book. Okay, that's okay. You don't want to read anybody else's book. You only want to read books that are part of the official narrative, which is okay. That's your choice. But when you start ridiculing people, right, for their points of view, and then you refuse to look deeper into what it is and why they're saying it, then that makes you, okay, I won't say laughable. You're entitled to your point of view. But what I will say is that you really can't be taken seriously on this.
No, he's biased from that point of view. He's biased towards the official narrative, which is man landed on the moon. Anybody who says they didn't, of course, is a complete idiot, a conspiracy theorist, and should be dismissed out of hand.
Yeah.
Well, they've been trying to do that for 50 years, dismiss people who claim nobody landed on the moon.
Exactly.
Now, I feel actually quite insulted by the fact that Simon Dan has not have a go at me. Why not?
He's afraid.
Well, because I mean, I would say that the subjects he should cover would be vacuum in space, the effect it has on man-made objects, what outgassing is about. You know, he's Sci-Man-Dan, he's supposed to be scientifically based, not propaganda based. And so get on with it, you know, talk about vacuum and then introduce what I've said and where that came from and what the evidence for vacuum harming photographic film is, because there's plenty of it around. So
Yeah.
I don't want to feel biased. I don't want to feel insulted. I just want to feel included. So Sci-Man-Dan, have a go at me. I look forward to it.
Well, I'd be really surprised if he does. And if he does have a go at you, Marcus, it'll certainly be from the safety of his studio and a video. He will not take you on directly. And the reason why, and the other thing that I've noticed with people like, it's not just Sci-Man-Dan, there's others like him. Scientists don't come across and ridicule others for not believing them. What scientists do is they come forward and say, okay, here's my evidence, and I encourage you to question me. Sci-Man-Dan doesn't do that. And a real scientist, and that's what science is all about, is that they say, okay, prove me wrong. I'm actually serious when I'm asking you to prove me wrong, because that, if you can't prove me wrong, that helps to prove me right. And you know, they will argue that, well, there's, you know, decades of this and decades of that, but there has been some really good examples where decades of this and decades of that have been discredited by other scientists. And for people like Sci-Man-Dan to come out and say, this is laughable, no, I don't believe it, why would they do this, instead of like all the emotional responses, okay, tell me, come up with some counter arguments. And his counter argument is that, well, would be, and it's very predictable, is that thousands of scientists have validated the moon rocks, thousands of scientists have validated the technology involved in the moon mission. The only problem with that is that nobody's actually, for anybody who wants to analyze the moon rocks, they're carefully selected by NASA. Joe Soul scientist cannot just walk in there. He has to be approved. They do a background check. In other words, and you know, you have to work for an approved institution, funded by the government, so on and so on and so on. And even with that, some of these samples have come out.
I'm get my piece of moon rock so we can.
Sure. I'll keep talking. Yeah. So even with that, some of these samples have discovered to have been fake, and then a lot of these samples have discovered to have been gone missing. And in terms of the technology, when scientists say, yes, the technology is there, but the technology is not there anymore. If it was there, it certainly isn't here now, which is really baffling as to why as to why NASA and the contractors per se would destroy this wonderful technology. Just to digress for a second for everybody here, Marcus and I are going to actually change the gears a little bit. We're going to talk about some other stuff as well as the Apollo Moon missions. So we thought we just, something a little bit different as well as the Apollo Moon missions. So we'll get into that shortly. But I just find it very interesting that people like Sci-Man-Dan and others like that before. I mean, we saw this from a couple of others. The names escape me right now. The absolute ridicule. You look at, if you want to ridicule me, that's okay. I'm actually okay with it. But when you ridicule me instead of having a serious discussion, then, I just don't take you seriously. And of course, you will argue, well, nobody takes you seriously, Randy. You can hear that one coming, right? Yeah. But really, that's not what science is about. Science is about opening the doors, showing all your evidence, not throwing it away, which NASA did. And when I say NASA, I'm incorporating all of the major contractors and subcontractors. Yeah. But you would be inviting people to come in. Here's my evidence. Here's the telemetry tapes, has all the data on it, which is being destroyed, right? Here is all the schematics for the F1 engines and the Saturn V and the lunar module and the command module, most of which is being destroyed. Yeah. So that, none of that makes sense. In other words, the bottom line is everything that NASA has done is contrary to what science is about.
Good point. Very good point. And science does not have a consensus.
Yeah.
people who say the consensus of scientists say, that's absolute rubbish. That's propaganda. Science cannot have a consensus, because science, if it has a consensus, it's politics. It's not science. No science has a consensus. We were talking about moon rocks. Here's my moon rock. And you said that some of them, in fact, there was about 20 years ago, a lot of moon rocks from NASA's depository at the Johnson Space Center were stolen. They were recovered quite soon. A guy walked out with a 6-foot-high filing cabinet full of moon rocks. Maybe this is one of them. Who knows? Maybe they weren't all returned. How do you know it's a piece of moon rock? Because I say so. Same as NASA says, they've got moon rocks. They've examined them.
And most people, as you say, do not have access to that and has to take NASA at its word. Yeah. And taking NASA at its word is one thing, but given their history, the last 50 years of what they've done with this technology, it makes it very difficult to take NASA at its word and the scientists that they recruit or approved to check this. And yes, I am calling out scientists. Sorry to interrupt you, Marcus. I am calling out scientists on this because scientists that they look at specifically, seems to me that they have to be working for a funded, an accredited organization. In other words, no independent scientists, or not that I know of, and maybe there are not really taken seriously when it comes to analyzing moon rocks, yet they have the same knowledge as a scientist who works for an accredited organization or an institution that's funded by government or corporations.
Now, most moon, somebody will say at this point, well, moon rock's been examined by universities around the world, which is true. They have. They would have applied to NASA, say, please, can we have a piece of moon rock so we can examine it? And they would receive a package from NASA, marked moon rock, so they know what they were looking for. Now, NASA, in many cases, paid for the research that these universities were doing into the moon rocks. So do you think there's universities relying on funding from not only their own government, maybe from abroad as well, would come up with a categoric statement and demonstrative proof that the moon rocks were not from the moon or couldn't be proven to be from the moon? Because one of the tests that was done was an examination of 3 types of rock. One of them was moon rock, obviously. The other was from the Columbia River Basin on the west coast of America. And the other was from Hawaii, which, as we all know, is a volcanic island. And they were asked to compare and contrast the various elements of those rocks. And surprise, surprise, they came up with the conclusion that the moon rock was different from Columbia River Basin volcanic extrusion or from the Hawaii volcanic eruptions. Well, of course, they're going to come up with that statement, but other people will claim that there is no difference with moon rock from natural volcanic eruption rocks here on Earth, because basically it's the same thing. So if the moon rocks they're not fake as such, they're genuine rocks. It's a matter of where they came from and who was involved in it. That is basically the question that we're trying to answer. I don't think it's been fully answered. I mean, you can see pictures of moon rock rather like that with zap pits in them. Zap pits would be strikes by micrometeorites, creating a little zap, a little pit. Well, what does that prove? It doesn't prove anything, really. And anyway, a piece of moon rock, if it was genuinely from the moon, it would be radioactive.
Yeah.
Which is not being commented on very much by these scientists who observe it. And there was a case recently, I think it was last week, where, no, it was the 50th anniversary of something in NASA. They had this aluminium case full of moon rocks. I don't know which mission it was, it doesn't really matter, but because all missions brought back aluminium cases of moon rock.
Yeah.
And they opened this case to examine these moon rocks. Hang on, they opened the case, aluminium case with rubber seals around it. If it was genuinely on the moon, it would be encasing the vacuum levels on the moon, which, as we know, are quite severe.
Yeah.
A rubber seal would not in any way prevent the entry of Earth's atmosphere because of the difference in pressures. Whether they're going to examine them, I mean, they were sort of rocky type thing. They were quite big, some of them. I think it was about 20, 30 kilos of moon rock, alleged rock. But if it was encased on the moon and returned to Earth, the case would contain the vacuum level of the moon. As soon as it comes into Earth's atmosphere, it would be compressed. It would be damaged. The box would be damaged. It wouldn't, aluminium wouldn't stand that sort of pressure.
That's a good point. That's a very good point.
Yeah. So all these little anomalies in the record, and we're expecting to believe the official story. And you can call me conspiracy theorist, and many people have done so. It doesn't really matter. All I'm saying is, look, this is another question which needs to be answered. How do you keep a vacuum level in an aluminium box when returned to Earth isn't showing a form of damage that would be created by the atmospheric pressure? That's all I'm asking. But
sorry, go ahead.
Oh, but people will then extrapolate that onto, well, he's a conspiracy theorist, therefore everything he says is completely wrong. No, that is one of the most ridiculous arguments you can have, because the only way that science has ever really advanced, I mean, there are many examples through science, Schimmelweiss and the circulation of blood in the body. He was ridiculed for that. How can blood circulate in the body? Well, we know it's the heart pumping it around. Alfred Wegener talking about continental drift in the early 1960s, 1950s, 1960s. The continents move. Oh, don't be so ridiculous. The continents can't move. They're far too big to move. No, that's rubbish. Now, it's a totally accepted scientific fact that continents do move, and that's what they've been doing. And but he was ridiculed, almost driven out of science by this sort of backlash. Yeah. And there are backlashes against anybody who goes against the accepted narrative. So I think we're in very good company. Very honorable company. People who've stuck to their guns, who said, look, this is the questions that need to be answered. Let's just pose the question. I'm not suggesting the answer. I'll pose the question, can you come up with a better solution than has been approved? So, I mean, we heard all about these Apollo missions going to the moon, landing 12 astronauts on the moon in 6 missions, returning them safely to the Earth. That's the basic premise of the Apollo missions. We're saying, well, no, it didn't actually happen that way. It couldn't happen that way for these reasons. And you've outlined it extremely well about the lack of ability of the Saturn V rocket to do what we were told it did. So you've asked many very, very pertinent questions on that subject. Whether anybody is prepared to answer them, who's in a position to answer them, probably many of them are not in a position to answer it because they don't have access to the information that they need to have access. It's like the point you make about the cooling of the engine. How is an engine cooled? Because it generates enormous heat. Was the Iconol, I think, anyway, the tubes that carried the fuel to cool the engine before it was ignited, before the fuel was ignited, were they strong enough, powerful enough to do the job that we were told they did? If they weren't, there's a problem. And you've outlined that extremely well. Plus also the navigation. I mean, you're a pilot, you know what's required for navigation when in space. Well, not in space. I don't think you've ever flown into space. You probably
don't want to.
Oh, all right, don't want. But you're perfectly aware of what's required for navigation over distance, which is one of the very first points I picked up in your first book. I thought it was a very, very good point and very well made. So these are perfectly valid questions. Your answer to it may not be correct. I don't know. I'm not a pilot. I don't know about navigation to the extent that you do, but you ask very valid questions, have never been addressed by these NASA parrots, as I call them, people who only repeat what they're told to say. And the NASA defenders are under increasing pressure to to examine these things, and they're not doing it. It's as if they're frightened. Well, they probably are frightened because they know they're on a hiding to nothing, as we say in the UK. It's a sticky wicket, because we play cricket and you don't, but never mind.
You know, you brought up some very good points that I've been writing down that I kind of want to revisit.
Okay.
I'll get back to one of them in a second. Just mention navigation. I think my point was, and yeah, I mean, I don't know for sure. I mean, nobody knows for sure.
Yep.
But I was just using my knowledge as a general aviation commercial pilot in terms of nav, and sort of taking that, extrapolating that, and looking at the distance between the Earth and the Moon. Now, what the astronauts were doing is correct. That party official, you would be using the stars to help navigate. Excuse me, to help navigate from the Earth to the Moon back. But what they were actually doing is that they were using, they were doing it manually. Basically, they were doing it manually. And then they would be communicating back with Houston to get updates. And Houston would be doing its own tracking from there, which was very difficult because it didn't really have tracking capability. So they're using what is called the Doppler effect, right? And I'm not going to get into that now, but people can look that up, and it's in my book anyway, and I explain that. But all of this navigation, all of the star patterns that you would need to navigate from the distance between the Earth and the Moon and back would really need to be fed into a computer, and the computer would have to have the ability to store all that information, which the Apollo computer did not. It would have to have the ability to store all that information and to make its own decisions according to its software program. And of course, it didn't have that capability. It needed input for the astronauts. And that's where that for me was a red flag. And I remember, as I said in the book, when I was talking about a video I just happened to, or a documentary I just happened to see when I came home from work one night about, over 20 years ago. And it was about halfway through the documentary. I think it was on A&E at the time or something like that. And they were talking about one of the Apollo missions. It was about the Apollo missions. They were talking about having to use the moon as a slingshot to get back. And I knew enough at that time that they were talking about Apollo 13.
Yeah.
And the commander of Apollo 13 was talking specifically about, well, I have to, and I know exactly what he said. He said, I have to, when I fire the engines, I said to this is him talking, I'm paraphrasing him. When I fire the engines, you have to keep the Earth within a grid pattern on the window. Now, I'm assuming he meant the grid pattern on the window of the lunar module. I mean, he didn't say specifically lunar module. He just said the grid pattern on the window. Now, there is a grid pattern on the window of the lunar module. But of course, the official narrative says, no, that's not what they were doing. They were keeping the Earth within a grid pattern through the optics of the lunar module. And I read that in David Baker's book, right? So the official version is that they're using the optics, but in the documentary 20 years ago, and of course in the movie, Ron Howard's movie, Apollo 13, they used the window in the lunar module, but the whole configuration would have been wrong if you want to go by the official version. They would be, instead of flying this way, they would have been flying sort of, that way. So there's the command module and there's the lunar module, right? And instead of flying, how can I put this, horizontally, they would have been sort of, I guess, perpendicular, if I'm saying that right, to the Earth. Yeah. So, I mean, and that's just one example of all the mixed messages and the details. And this is why I got into the details, because the answer is in the details. And Scott Henderson has done that very well with his analysis of the NASA's photographic and film record. Yeah. And he has noticed, and Skyman Dan didn't pick up on this, but he has noticed, he was ridiculing Scott for, well, the mud on the spacesuits and so on and so forth. But what Skyman Dan hasn't didn't mention, and maybe he hasn't seen this, is that, and this is a good point that Scott brought up, is that you have photos where he's completely cleaned off.
Yeah.
Right? And those photos were touched up because those photos, the photos that show the amount of mud that were on the spacesuits, the same photos are now clean. And the same thing, Marcus, and you brought up, and I want to get to another point here in a second, but the same you brought up with the famous photo of Buzz Aldrin on the lunar surface. I've learned this from you because I'm not a photographer. I don't talk about photography in my book because that's not my expertise. That I leave that up to you and to others who are really good at it, like Robert Williams and Scott Henderson, of course, and yourself. But it made sense to me. So the original photo of the official original photo, that is Buzz Aldrin on the moon, was supposedly was taken by Neil Armstrong, was on the cover of Geographic. What's that magazine? National Geographic.
Yeah, National Geographic, yeah.
Yeah. And in the original photo, you see lighting around, and correct me if I'm wrong, because I got the point, what that you were trying to make. The lighting around Buzz Aldrin falls off very sharply.
Yeah.
And that doesn't make any sense because, number one, the moon doesn't have an atmosphere. And number two, it would be like shining a light on a tennis ball from a short distance. The whole tennis ball would be illuminated.
Yeah.
There would be no drop off of light.
Yeah.
And that point was made very clear by researchers as yourself, that why is the light dropping off? And soon as that came out, as soon as researchers like yourself brought that out, NASA puts out another photo where the light is illuminated throughout the whole. There was uniform lighting is the word I was looking for throughout the whole of the picture. And and people can argue, and they'll argue that, well, it's just it was just a bad photo. NASA cleaned it up, but no, NASA didn't clean it up. NASA touched it up.
Yeah, touched it up. Actually, there's one point. The first person to identify this fall off of light and the pool of light in which Buzz Aldrin is standing on the Apollo 11 pictures was David Percy. And he describes this in his book, Dark Moon, probably the definitive book published in the last 20 years on the general subject of Apollo.
Yeah.
Because he spent 8 years researching it. And he's also a photographer himself, he's a filmmaker, so he's used to cameras, he's used to equipment like that. He knew what he was looking at.
Yeah.
And you say that NASA have touched it up. No, what they've done, they've enhanced, they've reduced the contrast. So it appears much less contrasting. The original photograph, the one that appeared on the cover of National Geographic, that's the original photograph.
Yes.
That's December 1969 that appeared. You could see it plain as daylight. You could see this lack of fall off. Because go outside any day where the sun is illuminating a field or doesn't matter what it's illuminating, any large area, and the amount of illumination where you are will be the same level a mile away, 10 miles away, 100 miles away. It's the same level of illumination because the sun is so powerful and so far away that it can't have fall off. And when you identify fall off in any lunar photograph, you know it's a studio shot. They were using big spotlights, 20K spotlights.
Yeah.
Or possibly, when they got the hang of doing it, they would use outdoor sets so that it was less likely to be that. But for Apollo 11, they didn't do that. Yeah. The whole thing was shot on an Air Force base in New Mexico. And they got it wrong because they didn't have enough information at the time to ensure that the details were correct. And it's, as you said before, it's in the details that you see the problems. People may not,
this is it, yeah.
People may not like you explaining the details and the problems in the details, because that's why they get so upset about it, because they want to believe their historical narrative that man landed on the moon. No, man has never landed on the moon. He couldn't land on the moon. The rockets couldn't do it, as you explained. He couldn't find their way there, as you explained. They couldn't land there. They couldn't take off again, then had to navigate back home again. And anyway, if the command from Jim Lovell on Apollo 13 was keep the Earth within the grid pattern. That implies that somebody is standing by with a rocket to alter their trajectory if the Earth moved outside that particular place that it was supposed to be, because the rocket will continue on the trajectory it is at that time, because there's nothing to change it. If it's on the wrong trajectory, it has to fire its rockets in order to get back on the right trajectory. But there's no evidence that that was ever done. Hence, the whole thing is a fabrication.
Exactly. And that was actually the first red flag for me when I looked at this. And it was at the time when I was training, and at that time I already had a private pilot's license, so I knew, well, I'm not an expert. I wasn't an expert and not an expert really. I don't think anybody's an expert, but I was looking at when I looked at the navigation part, and I used the analogy, of course, of flying. And, when you're flying from A to B, you have to have, you map out your track. And they train you that when you're mapping out your track, you have to check your track every certain intervals through your flight. So let's say it's an hour flight from A to B. So you'd be tracking every 10, 15 minutes to make sure you're on track. Because if you're off track, then of course you have to correct. Yes. And correcting translates into more fuel because you're off your track, and that translates into more time. So now you've got two things happening here. You have to use more fuel, and you have to now recalculate your estimate time of arrival. And so I put that on a larger scale. And I looked at the command module coming back from the moon, any of the missions, you could put it that way, but specifically Apollo 13. And they would update they had certain intervals, 2 or 3 intervals where they would update their track, but there was nothing in between those intervals that they could use to indicate whether they were on track, and which would have been impossible for you to do manually. You need a computer to be continuously doing that and continuously updating every second, not every several hours. I don't know the exact times that they were doing the checks. I've forgotten about that, but that detail, can't remember all the details. But you would need a computer doing that continuously on a continuous basis every second, because if you're 1 degree off track from the moon to the Earth, 250,000 mile difference, that 1 degree could translate into thousands of miles off track. And what's one of the rare elements, if I can put it that way, they had on board was propellant. And they had to be very conservative in the amount of propellant they were using, because that translated into weight when they were lifting off from the surface of the Earth. So propellant was a very precious commodity up there for them. So they had to be very careful. But so if they're off track thousands of miles, well, now they're going to have to use propellant to use the thrusters to get them back on track. And given what we know now, just the official version, it would have, if they were constantly doing that, trying to correct, it could conceivably have run out of propellant and would have been marooned up there in a permanent elliptical orbit around the Earth and the moon. So a lot of things just don't add up. And I mean, I've searched for a lot of these. I've read a lot of NASA documents, and I haven't really found anything in there that even speaks to that. They just tell you that the Apollo guidance computer worked well. It was a marvel of technology, fly-by-wire, and you don't need to ask any questions.
Your love's just like a wrecking ball going back and forth in a